Hello, good to be with you with the podcast on the creation of self, created souls. We've This is, I guess, our second episode, and I want to talk to you about the creation of self or created souls. Um, when we look at the culture, um, this is how I begin my book, The Creation of Self. There is a tendency to look at the soul as what I liken to the unwelcome guest. The unwelcome guest, insofar as we could think about the unwelcome guest, it's kind of a metaphor, right? And I think it's a good one. It's an important one. Um, the unwelcome guest is, you could think of it as that person who comes to the party who either wasn't invited or just is implicitly really not welcome at the party. They're often perceived as being awkward, bombastic, maybe a little larger than life. um, doesn't They don't quite fit in. They don't quite fit the status quo, the mainstream. They don't quite uh, show the same sorts of values or have the same sorts of values. They don't use the same sort of language and the cultural cues that are common within that particular party of friends. And so they are considered awkward, socially awkward, uh, unusual, um, mildly, at least mildly uncomfortable, maybe a little more than mildly uncomfortable. They are uh, 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 perceived as misfits. In other words, you might say they are um, not really wanted there. And the soul is kind of like that. Unfortunately, the soul is like that, even though it's this ancient idea, this old idea that has had a history of being true in most of history, in most religions, in most parts of the world, has been perceived as being true, and it is, in fact, uh, even in many religions still today, codified as a kind of an essential truth, uh, or an essential idea that fits with the doctrinal stances of that particular religion. And this is certainly true in what you would call much of Catholic Christianity. I use the word Catholic very broadly as we look at, say, the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and the doctrines therein about persistence into the afterlife, which presupposes something like a soul being an immaterial thing, or an immaterial core that makes up the person at a minimum. And it's that part that actually can persist into the afterlife and persist into the resurrection state where it assumes a new body, or the resurrected body, as it were. And this is standard Christian or Catholic Christian doctrine. And depending on where you stand, this is just par for the course if you presume um, Catholic Christian doctrine. And so it's normative and even essential if you're going to make sense of Catholic Christian doctrine. Um, there are naysayers out there. There are those who reject the idea altogether as being true of their own religion, particularly Christian religion in this case. But we'll set that aside for a moment, and maybe we'll deal with that at a later date, as we deal with certain objections to the soul. But um, but despite this fact, it's still the soul is still perceived as being eh, out of place, a misfit in the world of that we live in now, the contemporary world, where we're more enlightened and where we have, in fact, become more scientifically respectable, more scientifically reputable today. Now we don't need the soul anymore. We don't have any need for it anymore to make sense of the world around us. And so this ancient idea is really an outdated idea. That's the perception, at least. It's really kind of an unnecessary add-on that we got from religious perspectives. And anyone who knows science knows better than that. And at least that's a common idea. That's a common perception, especially amongst many public intellectuals or public scientists who are out in the world talking about these sorts of things. Um, Certainly, there's been a renaissance or renaissance of talking about the mind body and the mind body problem or the mind body relationship. And there's been uh, a strong interest in many recent years in neuroscience, the brain sciences. And even more recently, there's been um, a kind of a motivation of what's called uh, property dualism, the view that not that you are a soul and body, but that you have these conscious properties and these you have consciousness and you can experience the world. And these features of our minds are distinct from our brains or our bodies, and they're to be taken seriously. But there's other views on offer, some that even reject that, called eliminativism or illusionism or fictionism or um, reductionism, where conscious properties are just reducible to brain states themselves. And these have been quite popular in recent history. And now we're seeing a renewed interest in what some would consider an older view called panpsychism, the idea that from that there are both mental and physical properties, and at its base, it's not always entirely clear what it is at its base, but nonetheless, there are these mental and physical properties, and all of reality is somehow um, mental or has um, mental properties or is proto-mental or something of the sort. This sort of view is becoming far more popular and far more of interest in um, popular discourse, as well as in a broader um, discussions about the mind and the brain, neuroscience, and it's been something of a hot topic as of late. Um, and if you're familiar with the discussion, you can just peruse it. You'll find that as there are discussions of physicalism, um, and physicalism is kind of going out of popularity, uh, and we're seeing this renewed interest in what's considered an older view called panpsychism or something of the sort, going back to Bertrand Russell. This idea that there was this sort of underlying substance of mental properties and physical properties or brain properties, neural properties, and we don't know really what it is, but nonetheless, it seems to be the best explanation of the fact that we have these two distinct types of properties in the world, where consciousness really is unique in the world and radically different, say, than the publicly observable properties of brain states, but nonetheless, they are somehow at a deeper ontological level uh, united or one, um, say, rather than a sort of substantial dualism that holds at at a deep level that there are two types of things. So this has become far more popular and has become popularized by the likes of um, in recent history, the really atheistic and secularist philosophers who still buy into what's called naturalism. Naturalism, the view that that the universe itself is somehow causally closed, and that explanations are of even mental states or consciousness states are explained by way of physical mechanisms or physical events themselves. Um, and so fully explained by or within nature itself as a closed causal system. And as people are taking consciousness more and more seriously, once again, we're seeing this interest in something like Bertrand Russell's view or some version of panpsychism that's out there that seems to be over time really replacing the kind of materialism or physicalism that's on offer and has been kind of the ruling paradigm, you might say, of the day in mind-brain discussions from philosophers and scientists of the day. But as people realize more and more that it just doesn't have the resources, it's just simply inadequate to make sense of consciousness itself. People are turning toward an alternative. And rather than turn toward sort of this even older idea that we are souls of some sort that could exist disembodied or exist in the afterlife, um, is kind of a wacky idea itself, right? Whether that's perception, it's a misfit. But rather than that, they're moving toward this more uh, Russellian monism, or what some philosophers would call neutral monism, or even distinct, and there's lots of varieties, which you would call panpsychism. And that's becoming the sort of dominant paradigm now, because as been made popularized by people like Thomas Nagel, to some extent, the famous philosopher David Chalmers, and now even more so, the kind of contemporary proponent of the view, Philip Goff, who has gotten a lot of attention, funding, and all sorts of things. Um, this sort of view still stands within a kind of broader tradition of secularism, whereby theism has very little place or role to play in providing some sort of explanatory framework for um, consciousness and mind-brain relations. And so, rather than go back to again this antiquated notion of the soul that was more prominent throughout history and more popular throughout history, many are moving in this direction because it still saves them a kind of naturalistic framework where everything can be, at least in theory, explained in this way without invoking a god or without invoking theism. And so that's the sort of trend right now. And unfortunately, that's the trend. And you can see it all over the place. I mean, if you look at Philip Goff and the kind of recent successes he's had, and his friends who are doing similar work, it's quite clear that funding is being placed here along these lines. But also, I mean, you could just peruse various sources, the John Templeton Foundation, as well as others that are putting a lot behind this. But even if you look at the Scientific American, where Scientific American has been for its history kind of the bastion of scientific naturalistic materialism, it too has begun to, at least it seems, recognize the cracks or the problems within its own sort of materialistic paradigm. And so we've started to see more and more openness, not certainly not to theism. And yeah, I mean that would be a complete misfit and out of place, certainly an unwelcome guest. And not even really to the soul idea or to dualism or substance dualism, but rather to this sort of panpsychist notion. I was just perusing their consciousness and mind body section and trying to see what kinds of things they're talking about, what they kinds of things they highlight. And they're certainly not highlighting any sort of ancient notion of soul body dualism or anything uh, 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 of the sort. Rather, they're still stuck in this sort of naturalistic paradigm, but they're open to this kind of um, this view, this panpsychist view that is taking more seriously the notion that consciousness is unique. Conscious properties are utterly unique, you might say. And so, but still within this sort of um, materialistic paradigm. Um, and so you've had some recent things that have taken place in recent history on mind-brain discussions and the wider sort of conscious discussions of society, but certainly there was a bet between David Chalmers and Christopher Koch about being able to map mental neural correlates and things, and they made some bet 20 years ago or something, and in recent history, that time has actually passed, and they've gotten no further in terms of developing any sort of science of consciousness. So, this notion of what was called promissory materialism, where materialists offer promissory notes that we'll get there someday. We'll provide more of an explanation for these sorts of things. We'll provide a richer scientific view. Um, well, we haven't gotten any closer. We're not any closer than we were 20 years ago, and you would expect that well, maybe we would be if, in fact, we were material things, which suggests that maybe we're something else, something altogether different is taking place or explaining or needed to explain consciousness itself. And so, but the soul idea, this sort of antiquated notion, is kind of uh, not only a misfit and an unwelcome guest, it's kind of the elephant in the room, as it were. And I wrote an article about this, co-authored an article with another friend, dualist friend, about this. In fact, it is kind of the elephant in the room. And these other options on offer that are kind of slowly, it seems, but quite clearly replacing materialism, like panpsychism or something of the sort, um, are kind of the final frontier for the naturalists and secularists who really don't want to have anything to do with God as the explanatory cause of us, of persons, of souls. And furthermore, the notion that we are souls, or that substance dualism is true, that we are soul body compounds of some sort. And so this paradigm that I offer in the creation of self is not only unpopular, it's largely ignored in these wider discussions. It shouldn't be. It doesn't deserve that place. It deserves a place of recognition. And as we're seeing the cracks in kind of the naturalistic and materialistic worldview or paradigm, there's a real opportunity for Christian thinkers, philosophers, and theologians even to speak into the culture about these things, because the reason why it seems that they don't want to accept the soul is that, well, God is close. God is around the corner, waiting, because he is the proper sort of causal explanation of these things. But again, it's kind of this unwelcome guest, both God and the soul, because they're closely related. And I think as we become more and more attuned to consciousness and consciousness studies, then I think rightly we should become more open and honest about the discussion and about the need for God Himself as an explanation, a causal explanation of the soul itself or of persons themselves. And because we need something else, we need something else to explain consciousness and the properties therein. So, um, anyway, this is what I offer in the creation of self, a case for the soul. And it's based upon, again, as I said in the first episode, an intuition. an intuition that I expound on, that I flesh out, that I develop as an argument for the soul, and the soul which seems to yield or entail God as the explanatory, the causal explanation of persons. And the various naturalistic, whether materialistic or other options on offer, they just don't seem to um, satisfy. They just don't seem to deliver the goods, as it were. They're insufficient as causal explanations of consciousness, and in fact, they are. But they're still beholden, once again, to this sort of secularism, this sort of naturalistic framework without God, without any sort of theistic explanation or agential explanation um, that could adequately account for consciousness in the world that we live in. And so obviously something like the soul idea would be disruptive there. It would be um, a misfit, an unwelcome guest.